And on top of it, you pressed on my soft spot because Blade Runner is my preferred movie. Now the next speaker, Dr. Christian Busch, who is the Associate Director and Research Fellow at the Innovation and Co-Creation Lab in the London School of Economics. Christian will unfortunately have to leave us at 12. Christian?
Well, good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. My girlfriend tells me I have slightly erratic hand movements, so I'd rather not kind of constrain myself behind the microphone. It's great to be here. To give you the context, we believe that business model innovation and ecosystem model innovation is one of the most effective ways to alleviate poverty and to enhance progress. So over the last 8 years, we've been running an innovation center at the London School of Economics where we work with anthropologists, development people, management people to try to figure out what are the patterns, success and failure patterns behind the scaling of innovation, particularly innovation that enhances both financial and social impact. Can you hear me in the back with this microphone, or is that? Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much. We work around the world with researchers at local universities in Kenya, South Africa, China, India, and try to figure out these success and failure patterns, and then teach different master courses and executive MBA courses around this, and do a lot of workshops and other things. And I'm trying in the next 15 minutes to distill a 3-hour workshop into 15 minutes. If those of you, as was gladly mentioned, I have to sneak out a bit earlier, but if there are any questions or so, please do feel free. My email is included in the end. Very happy to catch up on those. So in terms of kind of the setup, we're obviously all aware of the kind of bigger issues we're facing, which are also great opportunities. The first one being the social and environmental challenges around unemployment, around the question of finite resources, skills gaps, but then also quite a few jobs not being filled because of the gap between skills and the actual labor required. Then we see the emergence of networked economies, the emergence of network markets, where we see new types of business models emerging. We see interesting kind of open innovation models. We see holacracy and other models that allow us to kind of tap into the dynamic of groups and question what organizational boundaries mean nowadays and how we should define those. We also see new customer segments and producer segments, particularly at the base of the pyramid. So the poorest of the poor, where we always thought, oh, this is more a charity case. We actually now understand, hey, this can be a very interesting market, but also can be very interesting kind of to try to integrate into the supply chain as micro-entrepreneurs, and I'll touch that later on. And then the last one I'm most excited about is the shift in needs and mindsets. It's the first time in history that we have such a transparency through the internet and other means that we can see which type of lifestyles can be lived, which type of mindsets can be possible, which then can inspire a lot of the innovations that I will talk about. So all of these things and many more challenges which we're aware of then trigger the need for inclusive innovation. And so over the last 8 years, we've worked a lot with innovators across fields, across age groups. These are 4 of them. And what struck me with these innovators is that they were of very different ages, very different industries, very different backgrounds. But what they had in common is they are part of what we call Generation Y question mark. It's a generation of people who question things, a generation of people that is not constrained by age groups, the 20 to 30-year-olds, but by a mindset that wants to combine meaning and profit and who wants to combine purpose and career. The interesting thing, though, is that if you think about the existing corporate structures and organizational structures we face, they're still implicitly or explicitly based on this very old Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Who of you came across Maslow's hierarchy of needs? Yeah? So that's most of you. Those of you who haven't, it's basically the very old idea of Maslow that human beings have somehow similar needs. We first need to fulfill material needs, then safety needs, then emotional needs, then esteem needs. And if we still have time one day, then we self-actualize. That's where the purpose comes in. You can do that later. So someone like Bill Gates first sets up Microsoft, makes a lot of money, then builds a foundation and gives it all back. You first do well, then you do good. It's a relatively linear approach to life, and it's also relatively self-centered. What we believe is emerging is an enlightened circle of needs. It's an enlightened circle of needs where we want to fulfill these needs at the same time, but we also understand it is relational. it is in our enlightened self-interest to be not too self-interested. Because in a knowledge economy, the more I can give, as we heard earlier, the more you can take. But also in an age where transparency via different types of means becomes more and more at the fore, our digital reputation actually will long forgo us. And as Warren Buffett famously said, it takes decades to build a reputation and only seconds to destroy them, and that is particularly true nowadays. So what we believe is that there's a new kind of organizational model emerging across sectors, across industries, which has 5 pillars. That's the kind of, we labeled it impact organization. The first pillar comes back to what we heard in the introduction, the importance of purpose and the importance of making that purpose action-driven. So formulating why we're doing what we're doing. The joint venture, Alex and I just co-founded in the session we just had. For example, we defined that one of the biggest issues we face is that our children potentially are not present because they are all on their phones, on iPhones. So we believe that presence is one of the, or fostering presence both on the adult and the kid side is one of the most important challenges to actually keep our next generation healthy and mentally sound. We also believe that then if we build that organization, we would need genuine values. We would need to not have these kind of fake type values, you know. I will never forget that I did a workshop a few years ago with a multinational company, and there was the executive board, and I asked them, so what are your core values? And there was complete silence, and I asked again, come on, I mean, can you give me 2 or 3? You know, everyone pretended to be very busy on their phones, and then at some point one executive said, let me quickly Google this. So he went on the homepage of the organization where the marketing team put up all the nice values. And then he was like, oh yes, reciprocity, integrity, innovation. These were the different values. And the interesting thing was that these values, to them, were just a marketing exercise. Right? To them, it was something you put out there and then somehow you get people to buy into it. But actually, what people very quickly see is the difference between these values and genuine values, and particularly how these values are integrated into systems and processes. How can they integrate it into a selection process? So the people we would hire for our DigiKit company would be people who are aligned on these purposes. We would try to kind of define, how do we define reciprocity, integrate that into the selection process, then integrate that most importantly also into promotion processes. We've been working with some major banks, and the interesting thing is that what you see with some banks is that there is the willingness to embed a certain purpose, but then when it comes to the actual core processes like promotion, it is still promotion based on purely mostly financial value and financial benefit. The problem being that, again, we speak the one thing and we walk the other thing. So really the thing, implementing genuine values. The third one is decentralized connectivity. That is about integrating new types of organization, being that holacracy or other means that enable us to, in a way, empower individuals in different locations to do their deeds. To give you a very simple example, I don't know if you remember this TEDx volcano, the volcano a few years ago, the Iceland volcano with the unpronounceable name, Eyjafjallajökull, or something like that. Yeah, I'm sure we have an Iceland person here who could pronounce it much better, but yeah. So basically this volcano broke out, and as you might remember, all the flights in London were grounded for a few weeks, right? So you had in Oxford, you had the Skoll World Forum at that time, where you had the most interesting social entrepreneurs and kind of social innovators in the world in Oxford. In Cambridge, you had an event, I think at World Economic Forum or so, and all these fantastic people were all stuck in London. And some of them actually took the boat, because they were told 1.5 weeks you can go by ship to the US, and by plane, maybe 3 or 4 weeks, no place. So a friend of mine called me up in the morning, and he was, Christian, I want to bring all these people together. I want to organize a conference. So within 30 hours, he organized a full-fledged conference, which he called TEDx Volcano, where he brought together some of the key opinion leaders, from Jeff Skoll to others, 10,000 people on the recorded live stream, completely sold out with a wait list of hundreds of people. An event that usually costs thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars, that usually takes ages to organize. He did that within 28 hours. So how did he do that? he actually employed what we call decentralized connectivity. He went to existing communities and organizations where he knew they were multipliers. So he went to TED and said, I have a narrative, I have an idea. I want to have a TEDx volcano. Give me your brand. So they said, okay, we buy into the brand. Here's the TED logo, and we'll give you a few speakers. We'll call them up for you. He went to the Hub, a co-working space, who gave him volunteers and the space. They loved the idea as well. He went to Sandbox, who kind of gave some more volunteers to help that organize and to do some of the social media. So the reason he could do that is because there were individuals within these bigger organizations that were empowered to help him, but also because he plugged into existing communities and leveraged existing networks and groups. The fourth one is technology. Technology comes all to the point that we all tend to focus on apps and developing things. But in the end, technology ideally is a platform that helps us to aggregate and to enhance the activities we're anyways doing online. So if you think about, to give an example, we developed an innovation community called Sandbox over the last 10 years. And we always wanted to develop our own technology platform. So we put a lot of money into developing all these cutting-edge type internal programs and platforms. And then what we realized is that actually the only platform that really worked for us was an internal Facebook group. Because that's where the people anyways were, and that's where the people are used to using it and which they anyways want to use. So within this internal Facebook group, it is so easy for people to tag each other. And by tagging each other, you get this lateral accountability where people kind of reference to each other. In a way, they accelerate serendipity. They make positive coincidences more likely to happen because A, you have this kind of visibility, but also B, people can very easily introduce to each other because they have this tagging function and because anyways, anyone is online there. So for us, technology in the end, we realized we don't need a top solution. We just need to understand the current platforms and then somehow leverage them for what we do. And then the last one is around KPIs and incentives. So one of the projects we're doing at the moment is with a major international institution, the question of how do we actually measure our purpose? How do we measure all this that we claim? And there's some fantastic work, particularly in the social innovation sector, Acumen and other funds that have been working around defining social indicators. So really getting away from outputs. So how much money did we spend on a program? How many people graduated from an education program? To what is the actual midterm outcome? So how do we define the clear correlation of a certain output to an outcome? How do we then put numbers to that? And how do we understand that quantitatively? So those of you interested, I think Acumen Fund and so are very interesting sources for learning which type of KPIs or also kind of objectives can be interesting to measure. And then how to, in a way, go back to this enlightened circle of needs and say, if we really want people that self-actualize already now, we also need to measure how they could produce that so that we can incentivize them properly based on these. So in terms of, let's say this is kind of the bigger theme and the kind of 4 key pillars. So how do we create that? The first step was already briefly mentioned around the culture of social innovation or the culture of innovation in general. There's the wife of Roosevelt, Eleanor Roosevelt, who was much smarter than her husband. She said that great people talk about ideas, average people talk about things, small people talk about people. And we usually, when we work with an organization, we go into the organization and we do the water cooler test. Or nowadays, they don't have water cooler anymore, so like the coffee table test or whatever the equivalent. And so we stand there for a while, you know, maybe chat to some people, but mostly listen to the conversations. And what's interesting is that organizations with a bad corporate culture, what people usually talk about is people. It's usually, have you seen this guy? Oh, have you seen he again went out with this girl? Have you seen this? He again messed that up. Have you seen this? And so on and so on. It's usually a culture that is afraid of failure because you could be the topic of conversation tomorrow. You could be the one who tomorrow will be gossiped about. So that is the one kind of like corporate culture. The other one is the type where people talk more about things. So you would have people coming and say, hey, are you going to this event tonight? Have you heard? Like, we're going out tonight. Do you want to join in? Which is like slightly more interesting. And then the really interesting one is, particularly in the kind of Bay Area, when you go into very interesting kind of up-and-coming startups, but also bigger existing organizations, is that they talk about, hey, how can we improve this? Did you hear this in the meeting in the morning? Like, we talked about this and this. I actually have an idea on how we can make that better. And so that is really the culture that ideally is triggered. And so how to do this is a longer conversation. But for now, there's a great talk also by Simon Sinek. a TED talk on why we do what we do. I think it's a nice starting point to kind of create these kind of cultures. So basically arguing that we have to come away from saying what we do, I'm doing this and this is how I'm doing it, to why am I doing this? What is my belief behind this? What is my theory of change? And then triggering people to get excited about it. So to wrap up, some of the projects we are currently very interested in that are more around the social innovation part, which is basically saying how do we leverage innovation for the more social impact side. One of the ones I'm quite keen at the moment about is there's a study of social entrepreneurs. And we looked at successes and failures in the Kenyan agriculture context, and we compared what do these that succeed do differently than those that fail. Or like a better word for failing is probably that didn't succeed the first time, that might do something else at some point. And so they have this, there's a lot of interesting kind of dynamics emerging and a lot of different types of constellations of networks which you see emerging. But usually the ones that succeed are the ones that place themselves in the middle of an ecosystem, that become orchestrators of the ecosystem. To give an example, so one of the organizations that produces beehives, they make the big deals with the Tesco's of the world to, in a way, get access to the potential sellers of honey. And then they go to the farmers, they sell the farmers the beehive, but they get the World Bank and other funders in to actually directly finance the beehives for the farmers, because they know the farmers won't have the leverage to talk with the World Bank, but they do. So what they do basically is they not only look at their direct value chain, but they look at the value chain or the potential chain of their farmers and say, how can the farmers themselves finance that? And then they enable the financing for them and so on. So they orchestrate the whole ecosystem and really do that in nice ways. And I think the EBRD could have an interesting role also to work more with these kind of ecosystem orchestrators. And I've seen some interesting projects where I think that also already was the case. There's also really interesting kind of just small curious things emerging, like, in collectivistic contexts where, like in the Kenyan context, you have usually like a lot of stakeholder expectations. So, you have entrepreneurs that grow, and then as soon as there's growth to a certain point, the brother comes and says, I want a job now. The sister comes and says, I want to be part of this enterprise now. So what you see with a lot of the enterprises that don't work out is that they at some point hit the natural growth point, because then they have to take care of the family. And so what the clever ones did was they did something we called embedded disembedding. They basically, when the brother comes to them and says, hey, I need a job, they say, I don't have a job, but my friend has a job. And then the friend does the same to their brother and says, I don't have a job, but my friend has a job. So both brothers get a job, but both brothers get a job in an accountability structure, where they are now accountable to someone who is not their relative, which means that in a way, potentially, in these cases at least, they were more motivated. Another case, which I think is one of the most fascinating cases I've come across, is an organization in the Cape Flats called Reconstruction Living Labs. And Reconstruction Living Labs is former drug addicts who said, we don't trust the government, we don't trust multinationals, but we trust each other. So why don't we use the one computer that we have in the local hospice to teach each other how to use social media, to sell our handcrafts outside the Cape Flats, but also to tell our stories and to build a global community of practice. And so they developed a train-the-trainer model where, with a very simple education methodology, people among themselves teach each other how to use it. They then go proudly home and proudly teach it to their children. Their children again teach it to their friends. So you have a kind of whole empowerment network effect there. And the interesting thing is that scaled now into 20 different countries with almost no resources. Not because there was a great technology, but because they understand how to work with local leaders, local hospices that anyways have the people hanging out doing nothing. So why not taking a simple methodology and working with these local community leaders? So this scaled bricolage, the only thing they did is they enabled a platform, in that case a simple education methodology that then could be taken up easily by people to then make the best out of whatever is at hand. The human capital that is anyways on the ground, the materials that are anyways on the ground, and so on. And by that they scaled it without any financial resources. And by that they reached over 5 million people within the last 5 years. So to wrap up, I believe that the innovations of the future are system innovation, not product or business model innovation. So it is really on the level what we talked about earlier in terms of how the key partners work on an understanding what the key, not only supply chain looks like, but the whole ecosystem and how the different parts can be leveraged. It's about leveraging existing human capital. I think the old NGO curse was to throw money at people and think that was it. That was also the old Maslow idea, right? You throw food and money at people, which is actually a lot of times not what people need most. But something like our labs, where you empower people to actually be proud of doing something, it appears much more empowering. So leveraging this existing human capital, understanding new markets, like the base of the pyramid and other things, where there's a lot of dynamics, like the one we just talked about, but also where you see that clever organizations like Vision Spring do very interesting business in a box, where you would have a simple solution. You would go to local community leaders, ask them if they want to sell it, and then they would kind of build their own small enterprises around different type of products. And then, of course, reverse innovation is really seeing what can we learn from developing countries also for the West. For example, from our labs, what can we learn about processes on how to scale up without financial resources, and how do we do that in a jugaad way, so in a way that is really low cost and that really kind of brings it together. So I guess I'm kind of coming close to the end. I would love to keep in touch, so if you feel there's any kind of ideas or things you want to talk about, I'm very happy to. My email address is in the end. And I want to close, being German, I want to close on a philosophical note, which is that, I don't know, who of you came across Viktor Frankl? Couple? So Viktor Frankl, he survived the Holocaust. And he always wondered, why did I, Viktor, survive the Holocaust, even though all the other people who were in very similar conditions didn't? And he tells the story of the flight instructor. And the flight instructor told him, Viktor, if you want to fly like this, you have to start like this, because the wind will pull you down. So if you start as a realist, you end up as a depressionist. But if you start as an optimist, you end up as the real realist. And actually, Goethe used to say that. He used to say that if you take man as he is, you make him worse. But if you take man as what he could be, you make him capable of becoming what he can be. And I believe our role as institutions, as companies, as international financial institutions is to understand where people actually could be and then giving them the right tools to actually get there. Thank you. I'm heading off. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian, for your expose and your time. We are now 25 minutes late. Does it matter? Not really.